His voice was calm, almost whispering, but full of urgency. The woman was panting, her body trembling in the middle of a dark street lit only by dim streetlights. A thin rain made the asphalt shimmer like broken glass, and blood dripped from his temples. Heavy steps were heard getting closer behind him. The woman's shoulders went up and down quickly. Her breathing was labored. He tried to focus, but his mind was a mess. Who is this man? Why would he help her? Run now, or you'll die, the man repeated. The woman looked at him. Her eyes widened. He knew her. There was no way he didn't know her. That face, which he has seen hundreds of times on the screens of his phones, on billboards, and music videos, Kim Seokjin. Gene from BTS. But he's not what he's always seen. Not a guy who smiles warmly at the camera or jokes with other members. The genie's face was now full of something darker, alert, tense, barely, desperate. A sudden sound broke the silence. Get him. And before the woman could ask any further, the genie pulled out her hand and ran. Hanul pressed his chapped lips, his hands trembling inside the pockets of his shabby jacket. She sat on a park bench, closing her body because of the cold night air. His jacket was thin, and he hadn't eaten anything since morning. He shouldn't be here, but he had no choice. Her phone vibrates inside her bag. Her cracked screen displays messages she has read too many times. I'll find him. Stop hiding, Hanul. You know what happens if you refuse. He swallowed, his fingers clenched into a fist. He can't come back. He knows what awaits him if he gives up. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped him from his thoughts. A man sits on a bench opposite him, wearing a black hoodie and a mask that covers most of his face. But there's something about him that's familiar. Perhaps it was because of the way he stared into the distance, as if his thoughts were somewhere else. Or maybe it's because his fingers are constantly clutching something in his pocket, like he's grappling with a tough decision. Then the man sighed, raised his face slightly, and at a glance his eyes met Hanul. His heart was beating. Gene BTS. But before Hanul had time to process what had happened, someone shouted in the distance. He's over there. Gene immediately turned around. His eyes that had been empty were now full of vigilance. Then, without warning, he stood up and pulled Hanul along with him. We have to go. Now. And before Hanul could ask why a superstar seemed to suddenly be part of his nightmare, they were already running into a night full of danger. Because I'm running, too. Jin's words were still hanging in the air, mixed with the sound of increasingly heavy rain. Hanul looked at the man in front of him, his breath still heavy after running that far. Running from who? From what? No time to ask. From a distance, the sound of footsteps was heard again. They haven't stopped looking. Gene touched Hanul's shoulder, his eyes sharp. We have to go to a safer place. I know the place. Why should I believe you? Hanul took a step back, his body still trembling with fear. Gene looked at him for a long time before finally saying quietly, because I just saved your life. And without waiting for an answer, he grabbed Hanul's hand and ran again, down the narrow alleys of Seoul City soaked with rain. Hiding place, they arrive at an old building that seems to have been unused for a long time. Gene opens the rusty door and steps in, pulling Hanul along with him. Dim lights illuminate a small room filled with dusty items. Hanul could see a folding mattress in the corner, a few bottles of mineral water, and a black backpack. This is your place? Asked Hanul, his voice still containing disbelief. Gene took off his mask and sighed, sitting on an old wooden chair. No, I'm just taking a ride. Me, can't go home now. There was something in his tone that gave Hanul goosebumps. He swallowed. What is going on? Why are they after me? Why did you get involved? Gene was silent for a moment, staring at the window covered with dirty curtains. Then finally he said, because we're dealing with people we shouldn't be fighting. Hanul's heart beat faster. Who are they? Gene turned towards him. They control everything behind the scenes. Those who remove people who are too close to their secrets. Hanul shook his head, trying to find a more plausible explanation. I'm just an ordinary woman. I don't know anything about conspiracies or big secrets. Why are they after me? Gene looked at him deeply before finally whispering, because you saw something you shouldn't have seen. Something that should not be seen. Hanul's mind spun quickly. What does that mean? What did he see? And that's when the memory returned. A few weeks ago. Hanul is working overtime at a media company as an assistant editor. That night, he was tasked with sorting through files and videos that had just been submitted by an investigative journalist. However, there was one video that kept him glued. CCTV footage. Blurry picture of someone who looks like Gene. But the surprise is not only that I in the video, Jean is talking to a man in a black robe. There was no sound, only the movements of their hands that looked serious. Then suddenly, the man reached for something from under his suit. A gun. Before the video is interrupted, Hanul briefly sees Jean moving quickly, as if trying to stop something. Then the screen goes black. At that time, Hanul didn't think too far ahead. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But the next day, the journalist who submitted the video disappeared, and since then, Hanul's life changed. I was trying to save someone, but I failed. The genie's words hung in the air, creating a heavy silence. Hanul looked at him, his heart beating so hard that he could feel it in his throat. He wanted to ask further, but something in Jin's expression made him hold back. There's a wound there. The wounds were deeper than he could imagine. But before Hanul could speak, suddenly, brack, someone broke down the door. Jean moved quickly, grabbed Hanul's arm, and pulled him behind the old wooden shelf in the corner of the room. "Shut up," he whispered. Hanul held his breath. Heavy footsteps approached. "Look over there. He must be here." The male voice sounded harsh, full of anger. He could feel Jean standing next to him. Who are they? Why do they want Jean? And then, the voice sounded again, this time closer. "Kim Seokjin, get out now. You know you can't keep running." Jean closed his eyes for a moment, before finally whispering barely audibly, "They found me." The past is back a few months ago. Soul dissolves into the darkness of the night as Jean walks alone in a narrow alley. The hood of his jacket was interested in covering his face, but it was not enough to hide the look in his restless eyes. She was heading for a small apartment, a place where a man had promised to give answers to all her questions. When he arrived, the apartment door was already slightly open. Jean pushed him slowly and stepped in. "Young." His voice is slow, but there was no answer. There was only the smell of metal piercing his nose. Jean swallowed and went further inside, and that's where he found it. A man was lying on the floor, blood seeping under his body. Jin's eyes widened. "No." He knelt down, shaking the man's body frantically. "I'm late," he whispered hoarsely, and then, before Jean had time to react any further, he heard a voice behind him. "Put your hands down." Jean nodded. A man in a black robe stood in the doorway, a gun pointed straight at him. "Don't interfere, Kim Seokjin. It's none of your business." Jean looked at the man with burning eyes. "You killed him." The man just grinned. "We just make sure no one leaks secrets." In an instant, Jean realized he had just gotten into something bigger than he could control, and from that day on, he became a fugitive. Back to the present, Jean pressed his jaw, pulling Hanul closer to the corner. The men were still ransacking the room, turning tables and chairs violently. Hanul bit his lip, trying to control the fear spinning in his chest. Jean took a deep breath, then whispered, "I'll distract them. When I said run, you went out the back door. Don't look back." But trust me, Jin's eyes were sharp, leaving no room for debate. And before Hanul could say anything more, Jean stood up. "I'm here," he said loudly. The men immediately turned their heads, guns raised. Hanul ran. He pushed the back door forcefully and ran as fast as he could into the dark hallway. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of a fight, falling objects, the sound of blows, and the sound of shots. Hanul gasped. "Jean." But he knew he couldn't stop. Jean had already sacrificed himself to give him time, with tears almost falling down her cheeks. Hanul kept running into the darkness of the night, not knowing that this was just the beginning of a much bigger nightmare. Hanul gasped as the sound of gunfire echoed behind him. It almost staggers on a slippery wet road, but the adrenaline rush keeps it running. Jean, is he still alive? His mind is a mess. His feet kept stepping, jumping over puddles, down a narrow alley full of shadows. Behind him, the sound of footsteps chased him. "They won't let him go. I need to find a place to hide. At the end of the hall, he saw something. A small steel door that opened slightly. Without thinking, Hanul crept in, closed it slowly, and held his breath. Silence. Then the voice came. "I know you're here." The man's voice was deep, calm, but frightening. He was in no hurry. He knew his prey was trapped. Hanul covered his mouth with his hand. He could hear the man's footsteps approaching, slowly. Point 1 step. 2 steps. Then, a hand gripped him from behind. He opened his mouth, almost screaming, but another palm covered his lips. "Fight them, and you die," a voice whispered in his ear. Hanul stiffened. The voice did not belong to the man who was chasing him. He turned his head slightly and saw a familiar face. Jean. Blood dripped from his temples, but his eyes were still sharp. He's alive, and they need to get out of here now. Jean pulls Hanul behind the old shelf, hiding in the darkness. The man was still outside, looking for them. Jean pressed his lips to Hanul's ear and whispered, "We only have one chance. Follow me." Before Hanul could ask, Jean moved. Hurry. Quiet. Deadly. Jean slid out of the shadow, approaching the man from the side. With one swift movement, he struck the man's scruff. The man staggered, but did not fall. They fought. The first shot missed. The second shot hit Jin's ribs. It growled, but remained standing. Hanul can't just shut up. With all his strength, he grabbed something from the shelf, a long iron, and slammed it into the back of the man's head. The man fell down with a thud. Hanul gasped, his hands shaking. He's never done anything like this before. Jean looked at him. You okay? Hanul nodded, although his whole body felt weak. Jean nodded his head slowly. Let's go before more of them come. They came out of the room, sneaking into the darkness of the city that never sleeps. But they know, this escape is not over. Somewhere far from there, a man in an expensive suit sat on a huge chair. He sipped his coffee, his eyes coldly staring at the screen in front of him. On that screen, there was CCTV footage of Jean and Hanul escaping. A subordinate spoke in a cautious tone. They escaped again, sir. The man did not react. He took a deep breath, then said quietly, raise the stakes. He put down his cup of coffee and stared straight at the screen. We're not chasing them anymore. Now, we'll make them come to us. The word hung in the air, heavy like a burden that Jean had kept all this time alone. Hanul looked at him, his heart beating faster and faster. His sister? Jean has a sister. Who is he? His voice was almost whispering. Jean let out a long sigh, as if struggling to choose the right words. His name is Jean. Hanul had never heard that name before. But Jean stared blankly at the floor, his voice trembling. He's dead. So, 2 years ago, that night heavy rain poured down the city. Jean stood in front of a small house on the outskirts of the city, his hand shaking as he knocked on the door. The door opened slightly, revealing a young man with a face very similar to his, but younger, with a look full of suspicion. Young. Jean smiled, although tears almost fell from his eyes. Jean. I'm sorry I'm late. Jean looked at him for a long time before finally letting him in. The house was small, almost empty. There were only a few things and a pile of books on the floor. Jean looked at his sister. She looks thinner, more tired. You okay? Jean asked carefully. Jean sighed, then sat down on the floor. I don't know, Young. Jean sat down and waited. Then, in a low voice, Jean said, I found something dangerous. Jean frowned. What do you mean? Jean looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. Young, I think there are people who want to kill me. Hanul covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes widened. Your sister? She was killed? Jean nodded slowly. He's a journalist. He found something he shouldn't have found. Jean closed his eyes, recalling that night, the night when he saw his sister for the last time, the night when Jean disappeared. After the meeting, Jean tries to contact Jean repeatedly. No answer. When he finally goes to Jean's apartment, the apartment was empty. It was as if his sister had never lived there. Everything's gone. No documents, no records, no traces. Jean knew something had happened, and someone wants to cover it up. Jean spent months searching for clues. He talks to Jean's colleagues, tracing the investigation records left behind by his sister, and finally, he found the CCTV footage showing Jean's last encounter with the people who were now after them. Hanul squeezed his hand, trying to structure all this information in his head. So, the people who are after me, they are the same people who killed your sister? Jean nodded, his jaw hardened. And they know I'm looking for the truth. Hanul took a deep breath. All this is bigger than he ever imagined. Then, a question came to his mind. What did your sister find? Jean looked up, his eyes dark. Something big enough to kill him. In a small room in a cheap hotel, Jean and Hanul sit opposite each other. Hanul was still thinking about Jin's last words. Something big enough to kill him. Hanul swallowed. So, if I stay with you, I will also be hunted. Jean looked at him for a long time before finally saying, they've been chasing you. Hanul felt a chill running down his body. Why me? I don't even know anything. Jean clenched his hands. They don't care. If you're with me, they'll see you as a threat. A sudden knock was heard at the door. Jean immediately stood up, put a finger to his lips to signal for Hanul to be silent. The knock sounded again. The hotel manager, sir. There's a message for you. Jean glanced at Hanul before walking to the door, then opened slightly. A man stands outside, dressed in a hotel uniform. He pulled out a white envelope. Jean took it. The man smiled. Our special customer sent us this. Jean sensed something was wrong. Too late. The man grabbed something out of his pocket. A knife. Jean moved faster. He grabbed the man's wrist before the knife could penetrate his body. They wrestled in a narrow hallway, the sound of knives clashing with the air. Hanul froze, unable to move. Then, the man managed to break free and swung his knife at Jean. Shrek. Jean stifled a scream as the knife scratched his shoulder, but he did not retreat. With one quick movement, the genie pulled the man against the wall and slammed his elbow into his jaw. The man fell. Not moving. He looked at Jean. His eyes widened. Then they heard something. The sound of footsteps. A lot. Jean snarled. We have to go. Now. They ran out of the hotel, sneaking into the dark streets of Seoul. Jean finally opened the envelope that the man had given him. Inside was only one piece of paper. An address, and a sentence written underneath. If you want to know the truth, come alone. Jean felt his blood boil. They're waiting for him. You can't go, Hanul said. Jean looked at him. I have to. This is clearly a trap. Jean sighed, his eyes cold. I'm tired of running. Hanul clenched his fists. If you leave, you can die. Jean smiled faintly. I've almost died many times. Hanul bit his lip. He wanted to stop Jean, but he also wants to know the truth. Then he said, if you go, I'll go. Jean looked at him deeply. Hanul, I've gotten into this, right? Jean finally sighed. Good. But listen carefully. If something happens, run. Hanul looked at him sharply. You too. The car driven by Jean and Hanul drove on a quiet street, city lights glowing in the window panes. Hanul clasped his hands tightly on her lap. I still think it's a trap. The genie tightens the grip on the steering wheel. Of course it's a trap. But you still go? Jean nodded briefly. I have to. Hanul bit his lip. In his head, he was still trying to put together all the pieces of this puzzle. Why do they want Jean to come? What really happened to her sister? And more importantly, what do they want from him? They finally arrive at an old building that looks like a long-abandoned factory. Genie turned off the machine. Both sat in silence. Jean reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small pistol that he had hidden from the beginning. Hanul swallowed. I didn't know you brought that. Jean only smiled slightly. You will be surprised at many other things about me. He opened the car door. Hanul came out, even though his whole body was screaming that this was a bad idea. But his curiosity is stronger. He wants to know the truth. They walked into the building. Their steps echoed among the bare concrete walls. And there he stood. Seo Jean. Jean walked over, but Seo Jean raised her hand. Don't. Jean stopped. His eyes were filled with 1,000 questions. I saw them kill you, whispered Jean. Seo Jean chuckled. And I saw you crying at my funeral. Hanul felt his hair stand up. This is not the reunion it should be. Jean shook his head. What happened, Seo Jean? What did they do to you? Seo Jean tilted his head. Then he looked Jean right in the eye and said, I wasn't kidnapped, Hyung. I joined them. Hanul froze. Jean didn't move. He just stared at his sister, as if those words didn't make sense. Seo Jean continued, I chose this. I work for them now. You're lying. Jean said in a low voice, almost threatening. But Seo Jean just smiled. You think I'm a victim, huh? Seo Jean looked at him sharply. I have never been a victim. Hanul felt something cold creeping up his back. This doesn't make any sense. Why? Jean asked in an almost deathly voice. Seo Jean looked at him for a long time. Then he said, because I'm tired of being your shadow. Hanul can't breathe. All this, just a game. Hey, Jean said slowly. What are you doing? Seo Jean shrugged. You were always a hero. Always perfect. Me? I'm just a weak sister. The one you think you have to protect. His eyes were cold. Now look who is standing higher. Jean grinned his teeth. You work for them. For the people who tried to kill me. Seo Jean smiled. And I succeeded. Then a click is heard. The sound of a pistol trigger being pulled from behind them. Jean and Hanul looked up. .2 gunmen are ready to shoot. And Seo Jean just stood there, smiling contentedly. It's a trap. Seo Jean smiled a little. I just finally realized something, Hyung. He began to walk slowly, circling the genie. All my life, I have always been Sister Jean. Everyone looks at me and remembers you. Even when I try to be myself, your shadow is always there. He stopped and looked at Jean sharply. I want to get out of that shadow. I want the world to see me as someone who has control. Jean clenched his hands. And you think working with a killer will give you control? Jean chuckled. It doesn't work, Hyung. I lead them. Hanul widened his eyes. What? Jean nodded. What are you saying? Jean smiled, then waved his hand. From the shadows, a man in an expensive suit walks in. The one who has been managing everything. But he's not leading. Jean's in charge. Jean is the mastermind behind all this. So, Jean looked at Jean, her smile wider. We have two options. He lifted a finger. One, you join me. Admit that you lost, admit that I'm stronger, and we can work together. He lifted the second finger. Two. Jean turned towards Hanul. I killed him. Hanul froze. Jean nodded. That's not an empty threat. Jean pulls a gun from her waist and pointed at Hanul. Don't mess around, Jean, Jean growled. Jean just smiled. I'm not playing around. Hanul felt his body tremble. Is this the end? Jean looked at his sister, his eyes cold. Then shoot. The room became quiet. Jean raised an eyebrow. What? If you want to prove that you are stronger than me, Jean said, his voice full of challenge. Show me. Jean looked at him. Her eyes narrowed. Then, something happened. In an instant, Jean moved. A violent kick hit Jean's hand, making his gun bounce to the floor. Before Jean could react, Jean had already charged at her. They fell to the floor, fought fiercely. Punches, kicks, gasping sounds filled the air. Gunmen prepared to shoot, but Hanul did not remain silent. He grabbed a gun that fell to the floor and fired it up. Bang! Everyone froze. Hanul, with trembling hands, pointed a gun at them. Put down your weapons. But someone moves faster. Jean pulled a dagger from his pocket and, check. Jin's gun was already in his head.